In the next few minutes, you are about to uncover hidden secrets, bizarre mysteries, strange design choices, and hilarious oversights buried deep inside classic Zelda games, secrets that went completely unnoticed when you were a kid playing on a tiny TV with a controller too big for your hands, and by the end of this video you will never look at retro Hyrule the same way again, because what seemed like innocent fantasy adventures were actually packed with dark lore, developer jokes, rushed ideas, hidden messages, and mind-blowing details that most players completely missed. So stay until the end, because the final secrets might completely change how you remember the Legend of Zelda forever. When you first played the original Legend of Zelda, or A Link to the Past, you probably thought you were simply saving a princess, collecting rupees, and stabbing monsters with a sword. But what Nintendo quietly hid inside these games was a strange mix of mythological references, recycled assets, secret shortcuts, and design tricks meant to confuse, challenge, and sometimes even troll the player. Because early Zelda developers loved hiding things in plain sight, knowing that most kids would never slow down enough to notice them. One of the biggest secrets you probably missed as a kid is how brutally unfair early Zelda games actually were. Not because Nintendo wanted to punish players, but because the games were designed around experimentation and failure, meaning enemies hit harder than expected, dungeons hid essential items behind optional walls, and certain puzzles were nearly impossible without trial and error, which explains why bombing random walls became a perfectly normal strategy instead of a sign of insanity. Retro Zelda games also reused assets constantly, but in a way so clever that most players never noticed, because the same statue tree or dungeon tile would appear across different regions of Hyrule, subtly suggesting that the world was ancient, decaying, and repeating itself over time, which accidentally reinforced the entire timeline concept long before Nintendo officially acknowledged that Zelda even had a timeline at all. Another strange detail hidden in retro Zelda is how creepy the world becomes when you stop moving, because villages feel oddly empty, NPCs repeat unsettling lines, and entire regions exist only to test the player rather than serve the story, creating an unintentional sense of isolation that made Hyrule feel less like a cheerful fantasy land and more like a forgotten kingdom barely holding itself together. As a kid, you probably never questioned why characters trusted Link immediately, handed him powerful artifacts without hesitation, or spoke in cryptic warnings that made no sense. But looking back now, it becomes clear that these games assumed the player was already part of a larger legend, meaning Link was less of a random hero and more of a recurring force of destiny, endlessly reborn into worlds that were already doomed before he even arrived. One of the funniest secrets hidden in retro Zelda games is how Nintendo openly lied to players through manuals and hints, because some instructions were intentionally vague, others were outright misleading, and a few were clearly written by developers having fun watching kids struggle for weeks trying to figure out something that could only be solved by pure luck or obsessive exploration. Music also hides secrets that most kids never noticed, because many classic Zelda tracks subtly change tempo, tone, or instrumentation depending on location, creating emotional cues that guide the player subconsciously, making certain areas feel safe, dangerous, mysterious, or sad without ever explaining why, which is why stepping into places like the Lost Woods or the Dark World felt unsettling long before you understood what was actually happening. Even enemies in retro Zelda tell a story that was easy to miss as a child, because many monsters are corrupted versions of normal creatures, fallen soldiers, or twisted wildlife, implying that Ganon's influence spreads like a disease rather than a simple invasion, which adds a surprisingly dark layer to what once seemed like simple hack-and-slash game. There are also secrets hidden in item placement that most players ignored, because powerful tools often appear earlier than expected, while weaker items are introduced later, forcing players to adapt constantly and preventing the game from becoming predictable, which explains why older Zelda titles feel challenging even today despite their simple graphics. As a kid, you probably never noticed how strange time works in retro Zelda, because events repeat, regions reset, and progress often feels disconnected, creating the sense that Hyrule exists in a loop rather than a linear journey, which quietly supports the idea that Link's quest is one of many failed attempts to save the world rather than a single perfect timeline. Another overlooked detail is how much of retro Zelda relies on imagination, because limited hardware forced Nintendo to let the player's mind fill in the gaps, turning vague shapes into terrifying monsters and simple sprites into legendary heroes, which is why these games feel bigger in memory than they actually are when you replay them today. Hidden humor is also everywhere, because developers snuck jokes into enemy behavior, item descriptions, and NPC dialogue that most kids either skipped or misunderstood, including references to pop culture, internal development jokes, and moments where the game openly mocks the player for making obvious mistakes. Even dungeon layouts hide secrets, because many early dungeons are intentionally confusing, looping back on themselves in ways that subtly train players to build mental maps, which is why beating a dungeon felt like an accomplishment rather than a checklist task, something modern games rarely capture in the same way. Perhaps the biggest secret you missed as a kid is that retro Zelda games were never meant to be fully understood, because mystery was part of the experience, meaning unanswered questions, unexplained lore, and strange inconsistencies were intentional, not flaws designed to spark curiosity and conversation long after the console was turned off. Looking back now, it becomes clear that Retro Zelda wasn't just a series of games, but a collection of interactive legends shaped by limitations, creativity, and a little bit of chaos, which is exactly why they remain iconic decades later, despite their simplicity. So the next time you think about those old cartridges, remember that beneath the pixels, awkward controls, and confusing dungeons lies a carefully crafted world full of secrets, jokes, and ideas that trusted players to explore, fail, and imagine, making Retro Zelda not just a childhood memory, but a timeless lesson in how mystery can make a game unforgettable. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden secrets and want more deep dives into retro gaming legends, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing which Zelda secret surprised you the most, and share this video with another fan who thought they knew everything about Hyrule, because the legend never truly ends.